the kids at the very bottom are the ones that are suffering the most in this education system. I mean, when you're seeing some of these states and stats that are like 25% of kids are below basic on the benchmarks, that means that like a fourth grader that is below basic on math means they can't really identify what the difference is between an odd and even number. So let that sink in.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Hey, Mark Hallie.
The Mark Hallie Show.
How did you do it and why? Hey, and welcome back to the Mark Hallie Show. And today, we got a great guest. I'm really pumped to talk to him. It's Tommy Shultz. He is the CEO and founder of the American Federation for Children. And before we get started, I wanted to read your mission statement, only because it's a pretty tight one and gives us a jumping point for further conversation. So, pardon me, I'm going to hold it for a second. The mission statement: the American Federation for Children seeks to empower families, especially lower-income families, with the freedom to choose the best K-12 education for their children. Identify and develop tomorrow's leaders in the school choice movement. Well, Tommy, school choice is something that, hits my heart. So I think most importantly, let's let folks know just exactly what is the American Federation for Children.
Sure. We are the nation's largest school choice advocacy group. And that begs the question, what is school choice, right? And if we were to set the table here and we're talking about K through 12 education, so not higher ed, college, university, things like that. If we're looking at our K through 12 system writ large, right, we've essentially built a system that we put on autopilot since about the 1850s or 60s, where basically it's residentially assigned. That last 5 digits of your home address, your zip code, determines where you go to school. And in the late kind of and early 1980s, a number of people were trying to reform this system because you may recall, Mark, the kind of landmark Nation at Risk report that had come out in 1983.
I remember that.
And like a portion of that really captivated kind of the imagination of the country. It said, look, if we were to impose upon our nation, if a foreign power were to impose upon our nation the type of education results we're getting, we would view this as an act of war. So that kind of woke up a lot of people saying, we need to do something to fix this. And lo and behold, a number of people were giving out scholarships for kids to go to private schools, especially lower income families. They realized, look, we could spend down these, philanthropic enterprises to zero, we still wouldn't have fixed the system, right? So many of our founders and board members that kind of built what is now the American Federation for Children started from that, where they said, we need to start introducing options into the system so that your zip code didn't tether you to this educational path. So in the early 90s, charter schools, private school vouchers, those started getting passed at the state level. And then really the last 15 years, and in particular the last 5 years, it's really taken off. And it's because, again, going back to our mission statement, every family should have the freedom to choose the best education for their sons and daughters, right? It shouldn't be this, luck of the draw sort of a situation where, hey, you're a kid, you hit the birth lottery, you're going to a great school versus, nope, sorry, you're in the wrong neighborhood, you're going to bad schools for your entire K through 12 pipeline.
Yeah, that used to be the case where we were raised just out of Philly. Delaware County. Anybody knows Delco. But anyway, for those of you who are common to our area. But we were right next to West Philly. And, when you played pickup ball, I was always amazed at the lack of family involvement. And, that the kids just, when I was a kid, I used to think it was like this salt shaker in the sky and everybody kind of falls down. And, where do you land? I landed a mile or 2 miles on the other side of the cut with West Philly. If you're on the other side, things are not going to go good. The hole to dig out of is huge. So that's obviously what you're talking about with that zip code delineation.
And look, it's not just because, it was arbitrary that people designed this that way. There were deliberate things within segregation, right? Where you redline the district that says, hey, we want to keep all the black kids into that part or in that side of the community, and we want them to go to these schools, and we want the whites to go to these schools. So there's like a lot of pernicious elements that over the decades and decades that you now end up with the system that we have, where even though Brown v. Board of Education was decided more than 70 years ago, officially kind of ending the practice of segregation, right? Our zip code boundaries are in essence still segregating, families by mostly, income in a lot of ways, but really does have a lot of roots with kind of racial discrimination. So the policy mechanisms that we push for at the state level for the most part. We are working on a piece of federal legislation we can talk about. But at the state level, that's where 90% of the education funding and decisions happen. We push so that every family basically controls their child's education funding. So if you want to go to a public district school, great. If you want to go to a charter school, public charter school, great. If you want to go to a private school or some variation in between, homeschooling even, we push for policies that basically get families, especially these lower income families who have no power within the current system. We're basically evening the playing field, right? Every family now controls their child's education funding. You can take it wherever you want. And guess what? Like you said, when you're talking about families and parental involvement, parents are going to be so much more engaged if they know, wait a minute, I get that proverbial golden ticket for my son or daughter to go to a great school, and it's not restricted by their zip code. That changes everything.
I was overcome by I'm a history freak. And my brothers will get all angry with me because I'm sending them stuff about Henry the Fourth and whatever, James the First. But anyway, we don't have to touch on this too much. But I love the idea you were saying the Prussian system in the 1850s,
right?
And I went back and read about that some, and you were making a comment that there's a lot of similarities.
Yes.
Obviously it's altered to that, but the base of that, what is that, or what were specifically you referencing?
Yeah, so the Prussian system is what we copied essentially. And if you really did a big long arc of like what are the types of educational models, it's like there is that Prussian system, then there's the sort of English higher ed system where you've got these universities, and you can go for down a long rabbit hole on all of that. But basically, at the start of the kind of the Industrial Revolution, we were seeking more orderly factory workers, and we were seeking kind of a better militarized kind of a system that we needed to develop. And so this Prussian system, Horace Mann comes back, starts to institute this into this common schooling model, really change the framework of how we did things. There are some that argue that this sort of, let's call it factory style education system was good at the kind of outset of the early 1900s, helped us kind of have a step function of improvement for the industrial kind of nature of World War I, World War II, for America being able to be in a position of power there. Again, then there's others that argue like, look, the literacy rates never really improved that much overall when you actually implemented the system. And I always tell people, I'm like, why do you feel like kids are in most schools in America are in these neat and orderly factory rows? They've got the recess whistle that goes off. No different than a literal factory system. And now it's sort of like in the last, let's call it 30, 40 years in particular, it really doesn't make sense when you have such a knowledge economy, when you have all sorts of innovation that can happen. You have different types of, family kind of work modalities are all changing, right? The nature of the family and the nuclear family is just different. People move so much. You need a new system that meets the needs there. You just can't do that if you're operating on a set of law that says, hey, we're going to give you funding based upon where you live, and you got to go to only these certain sets of schools, even if there's a school right across the street that you could go to, like it's out of your zip code or out of your boundary, right?
Yeah. So that now all of a sudden now we got a battle on our hands.
There you go.
As I can only imagine, swords out for metaphorically. But I have noticed you mentioned in it critical thinking, and I went to an Augustinian school where they did force that on you. There was critical thinking in there. Like we were allowed to challenge the beliefs of the Catholic Church. We were able to really go after it. And I remember there's a couple priests that were they really enjoyed those kind of contentious conversations. Then I went to a liberal arts college. And in that one, you kind of had to spray your education around. And again, kind of a liberal arts thing where, it just was more open-minded and kind of forced you to, again, challenge people. Well, then what I've noticed in the last 20 years of hiring people at my business, the younger men and women come out and they'll be like, I'm a business marketing person, and I'm a small business. And I'm like, well, listen, we don't need a marketing person. We need somebody who wants to think about what they're doing, come in and say, hey, here's a couple action steps that we think would be good. Of course, the bosses will make a decision, but it's you're very willing to say, hey, let's think about that. And I guess I don't see that in the 25 to 35-year-old age group. It's a little too focused. So, what's your comment on that?
Yeah, look, when you talk to business owners, when you talk to people saying, look, we need problem solvers, we don't, and we're seeing coming out of, too many people who get college degrees, or they're not trained, or they're just not equipped for the real world. whole lots of things to unpack there. But if you look at how in the K through 12 space, at least, again, when you have a generally one size fits all type of system, it really is a one size fits none system, right? Because whether it's any aspect of the economy or even just the type of virtues we want to instill in a kid, unless you're able to kind of, have a very, rigorous set of values that or virtues you're trying to instruct kids on. So some of more of the old methods, the classical education type of methods, you're just generally going to lose that aspect of critical thinking. If you're also teaching to certain testing standards that those are out of whack, the product, only the kids at the very top are doing the best, who are the critical thinkers themselves, or maybe who have great parental and community involvement, different dynamics like that. You're just challenging the whole system. And what's devastating is too the national test results, even as we've really reconstructed our education system to orient around a lot of these tests that we put together. I mean, the national results that are coming out next week alone, with the new results, I think are going to be really bad. But when only
they'll flip you out when you.
Exactly.
I read them last night. I went through, just getting ready for this. I knew the answer, but I was looking at these charts and up and down and up and down. I believe, and you can add clarity to that, I think that it plays itself out in the grades that you're seeing across the public school system.
Yeah, like the public school system has somewhat of a deterministic set of the districts or the state level says, here's the curriculum, you got to do it. But then teachers and districts get to sort of create their own way of doing it to sort of meet these standards. And lo and behold, what are we seeing? Again, that whole one size fits none system where 60 to 70% of kids can't read at grade level benchmarks or do math at grade level benchmarks. And what's worse, Mark, is the bottom 25% of kids, right? That, especially, the new results are going to show this. We saw it after the COVID and the kind of lockdowns that had happened. The kids at the very bottom are the ones that are suffering the most in this education system. I mean, when you're seeing some of these states and stats that are like 25% of kids are below basic on the benchmarks, that means that like a fourth grader that is below basic on math means they can't really identify what the difference is between an odd and even number. So let that sink in, of like the real discrete challenges that we have in some of the worst communities in terms of educational outcomes, what that is meaning at driving poverty.
So
then there's
you
on
said,
your end
go ahead.
Let
me hit back for a second. Odd and even, or positive and negative numbers, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, odd and even numbers, like hard, if you're below basic, generally means you're having a tough time like actually distinguishing what that is. Or let alone, there's a stat that had come out that was really an eye-opening experience for me when I read it. In 2017, Baltimore, not far, down the road from where, you grew up in Pennsylvania, right? There was a stat that had come out, I'll let you guess this. Basically the state math test for high school seniors. What percentage of Baltimore public high school students passed that math test? This was 2017.
20%, 25, maybe 30. I'm taking a shot at it.
Yeah,
I might be low just because you set me up for it. But
you said 20% you think passed. Well, you're close. It was 13, but it wasn't 13%, Mark. It was 13 students in the entire Baltimore high school public school system that passed this test. Walter
13.
Williams, 13 students.
How many students are in there?
I think about 3,000. And Walter Williams, he's a columnist that passed away a couple years ago, writing about these results, he said, if you were the grand wizard of the KKK, could you design a better system at disenfranchising Black students in the Baltimore public school system? And he says, I would submit to you, no. I mean, that's the depth of the crisis that we're facing in our American education system. We basically have an undeclared state of emergency. Then there's the notions that you were talking about for businesses or anybody who has a kid that they're taking out of higher ed, where you're like, gosh, they've gone through K through 12 and then an additional 4 to 6 years on the higher ed front. And we're feeling like, gosh, this kid hasn't learned much, or they're really ill-equipped. Unlike in 100 plus years ago, an 8th grader might have been ready to go right into the workforce and could be pretty competitive. We're doing a lot of things wrong in education, especially the basics. This is why we need this revolution, and that's what we're trying to foster.
My kids, we moved them to the Catholic schools, and we are not, devout Catholics. We were trying to find, because my one daughter, we knew she was rambunctious, a little bit like me. We knew she wasn't studying. and we're like, okay, that was me. I was ultimately, getting just enough of a good grade to keep my dad off my ass, just enough. But my one daughter, we went in to talk to the counselor, and we said, she's getting like B minus, C plus, and we know she's not doing anything. And, so what should we do? How do we address this? And the general answer was, well, that little pocket in there, because she's got that grade, we really don't pay. That's not the one we're putting our energy into. And, so what you learned is it's the high achievers and the low achievers. But of course, the low achievers, a lot of them have, they're bilingual, things of that nature. So that becomes a mess.
Yep.
So we took our kids and we put them in the Catholic school.
Well, every family has a story like this, right? Where if you've got multiple kids, people see like, hey, one of them's crushing it in this one school. It could be district, could be charter, could be private. Then the next kid comes in, it's like they're not doing well, they're not assimilating, something's different. And again, all the more reason why it doesn't make sense when kids' interests, personalities, there's some kind of discussion and kind of retribution around this notion around different learning methods, because it's like, no, we actually know how to teach kids reading, math, etc. We're kind of taking on these kind of shiny objects that are of learning instruction that aren't actually useful, and is part of the reason why kids aren't learning how to read. Sold a Story was a really famous podcast that kind of dove into this on the science of reading, for instance. But setting that aside, all the more reason why you shouldn't be constricted to whatever, just your address is here, all your kids have got to go to this school. Because again, each kid, if you have 4 kids, 4 of them may have thrive in totally different environments. Some may want or do better in a home or micro school. Some may do well at that really big district school with the big sports and facilities. Some may be like, no, look, I'm hardcore engineering, and I know that's what I want to do, and I want to start down that path. Like, without that specialization, individualization, because it just can't happen in our current system. Or the other notion you talked about, which was a lot of teachers will talk about this notion that the districts or the kind of people managing teachers will say, don't worry about those high achieving kids in your class. You got to work to the middle or the kind of kids on the bottom. Well, that's you're leaving a lot on the table for those high achieving kids to maybe go do great things.
Statistically, you would think attack that statistic, because, okay, so one of my daughters, I don't think if you put her in any kind of school, in a mud shack, she would have just kicked it. She just was that. That was it. But, it's that middle of the pack that you'd think, okay, there's X percent there, like a business. Okay, how can I cut that down? Because I got to find a way to run this thing better. And, you might have to nibble away at it, but that becomes, your focus. Let me turn on a subject here. Your involvement, you're fighting the public school system, and obviously it's money. And I heard you talking the other day about your budget versus theirs. And I was like, I'm like, wow, you got to do some laser marketing. This is not, you know what I mean? You can't just be spraying it everywhere. So you got to find target. And tell us a little bit about what's that budget for public school system? I almost fell off my chair versus yours. And
Sure.
then after that, how the hell do you implement your money?
Sure. So what you're probably talking about is the number of. So we are obviously a 501c4, 501c3 advocacy organization that also does elections. We're focused on changing state laws. Sort of our counterpart on the other side is basically the schooling unions, and most folks will call them the teachers unions. That's sort of a misnomer, because they will take any school employee and even non-school employees that are just part of a broader system that they want to take dues money out of their paychecks. We deployed last year about $38 million. Mark, I know you know the answer to this, so I won't quiz you on it. But whenever I usually put the question to a listener or somebody that I'm speaking to, I say, how much do you think the unions brought in last year? Most people will say, gosh, I don't know, $300 million. And I'm like, you're close. It was about $3 billion that they brought in that they then deployed towards their kind of political influence machine. And this is on top of, look, the entire kind of K through 12 spending that we do in this country is about $1 trillion each and every single year. That averages out to about $20,000 per kid per year that we're sending in tax dollars to the public schools. So we're trying to reform the system that the unions are deploying $3 billion a year into every year to control the politics, to control the campaign money. And you go, what are they fighting? What are they upholding, right? Why don't they want these sort of reforms to the system? Because it comes down to power and control, right? They want to be able to rule this whole system with an iron fist. And usually they're always wanting more employees. They want to hire new, counselors everywhere, nurses
Yeah,
everywhere.
yeah.
Because again, that means more dues paying members to their kind of political war chest. Whereas we're saying we want to flip this paradigm that says we want the money to be controlled by parents. They then will dictate what schools will be, how the schools should be run, what schools they want to go to. The market will start to actually have incentives versus if you run this kind of monopoly system. And actually, for the most part, if your school district is doing worse, you get more money through various incentive streams. So it's like, wait, what's the incentive? You get more money to do worse. And the system doesn't change because who needs to change it when the money is just going to come in every year just for every kid that's enrolled. So that's where the unions understand we are the kind of fundamental threat to their power. And that goes to your notion around we've got to be really targeted. We don't have the unlimited funding money streams that they do. We have to be precise in which states we target, which political races we get engaged in. And we become really effective because the more the voters hear about what we're trying to do, which is, hey, parent so-and-so in Dallas here in Texas, would you like to have about $10,000 per kid per year deposited into an account that you control for your child's education? They kind of, their head spins. They're like, wait, I didn't know that's what we were talking about. So
Yeah.
we've been able to be really effective and get that ROI that, again, defeats this sort of Goliath in the political arena.
You mentioned all these fights, obviously budget, which is just sheer money, which, you're battling that. But now you're going state to state. And maybe you can give an example of where that is effective, where it is ineffective, a comparison for, the battles you have to fight there.
Sure. I'll give two examples. One is our home base now in Texas, because we're right in the middle of the change cycle, let's call it. For 30 years, the unions and the kind of powers that be have run Texas with an iron fist. And what's interesting compared to Florida, for instance, where we've been successful for 25 years, is Florida operates by a county school system. I forget how many counties there are in Florida. It's like 78 or something. Texas does not. Texas creates its own school districts regardless of county. So Florida's got their 70 some odd counties. Texas has 1,300 school districts versus the 70 counties there. So what you can imagine is an individual state legislator in Texas may have like 5 to 20 different school districts, meaning superintendents all making $300,000 a year and all their deputies and staff. There's just a huge money machine and a power center that is the district schooling system within each of these kind of legislative districts. And so Florida, when they pushed forward some of these major reforms and, they didn't get some of the bureaucratic fight, and they certainly had the fight, but we were able to win pretty effectively there in Florida relatively quickly. Jeb Bush was the hero at the outset of that. But Texas has been this resistance, and it's the 1,300 school districts that are just this really huge challenge in the scheme of things. And at the end of the day, we're about to pass a big piece of school choice legislation in Texas. We had to basically challenge a bunch of sitting lawmakers last year, defeat them in the elections such that we can actually get the opportunity to pass this law. Now, in California, it's probably impossible because if we were to do what we did in Texas, last year in Texas, we spent about $8 million in the election. To do this sort of equivalent in California, I would imagine we'd have to spend $50 million in the elections.
Yeah,
but
and
we'd have to do
a lot
that
of
for
palms.
well, and we'd have to do that for election cycles. So again, the unions sort of have this asymmetric, piece of power that they can hold against us, that they have so much money, and the more school districts there are, the more they can just create these little power centers. So we've been picking off state by state by state, and now, more than 30 states have some form of a private school choice program where a family can take state funding to go to the school of their choice. And 13 of these states basically make all families eligible and funded, which is really exciting. And that's the big change from the last couple of years that we've seen. And now, so that's kind of the dichotomy between, Texas versus Florida versus California. Of Texas was a long fight, but there was a path. Florida was a long fight, but there was a bit of more of an upward trajectory to getting, victory after victory after victory. California, to do this at the state legislature, the unions just control the entire Democratic supermajority there. They fund everything. It's just impossible.
Yeah, I'm a sales guy, So the name of the game is get punched in the face a lot, right? But you got to pick the clients that you can get, and so as a small business, you really had to look at it. I can't compete with the big guys. I have to create some form of differentiation. So I imagine for you, the client is somebody, some elected official within a state. And what I've learned from just chatting around is that can be very laser sharp. If I understand, like you got to get 5 people to pull them over. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so every state that we go into, we look at what you call in politics the whip count. So if you've got, let's say, a House of Representatives in the state that's 100 people, if you were to put a piece of legislation on the floor, what's the whip count? How many people are going to vote for it? How many against it? And oftentimes, like on our pieces of legislation, yeah, it might be just we need to flip 4 or 5 votes. And depending on how the districts are gerrymandered or whatever, this is where it's like you get a little more targeted. So you don't try and win over every single person and get every single person on board. It's like you're trying to get to 50 plus 1. And again, California is on the far end of the spectrum where it's like, no, we're going to have to flip. I don't even know how many votes we would need to flip there, but
it's 3 against 97.
Well, 70 votes. And then also we're going to get outspent, 50 to 1 or something. And if we're going, and even it's like we can get all of our message to the voters, but if we're drowned out because they're either, saying, every single TV ad that a person sees is just drowned out by the other side, hard to compete there. And so that's where, yes, we are targeted in that fashion. And then once we pass these programs, we're also, as part of our mission statement, trying to make sure lower income families are aware that, hey, state funding is available for your child to go to private school. You can imagine, Mark, the state government isn't going to really lift a finger to try and do a big, very well targeted marketing campaign. So we take on a lot of that burden saying, families, you should be aware you're eligible for this funding. You can take this funding. Some people don't believe it because they're like, what do you mean? This is a scam. And we're like, no, it is a state law. We've passed it. So that's another end of our kind of marketing targeting that we're doing that, like you said, it is about differentiation. It is about product market fit and finding the right audience.
Yeah. Now, this can get quite confusing. For me, I read about it and I'm still shaking my head a little bit this morning. I read it again and I'm like, oh God. I talked to my brother Andy and he knows quite a bit. And he tried to tell me about it, but again, my head's spinning. So let me get to the point. There's vouchers and then there, I believe, tax credits. Correct me if I'm wrong there. What's the delineation there?
Sure. Okay. So when we're talking about school choice, there are multiple mechanisms to achieve the end of letting parents essentially control funding. Some of this you mentioned Catholic schools. There's some history that actually informs why we choose certain policy mechanisms. But at a broad level, if you start at the top, if you go, there's public school choice, meaning public charters. They are independently operated, but they're still managed in some form or fashion by the government system. There's also, you've probably heard of magnet schools. Again, those aren't independently operated by like a separate nonprofit. The unions and the kind of district schooling system still controls that. So those are some of the things on the public side. The private side, meaning, okay, what are policies that allow a family to go to a private school in a state? Vouchers, the original kind of concept, it's just a scholarship, right? So a parent says, I want the voucher, I want the scholarship. The state government sends a check essentially to that parent to go to that private school.
And boom, so that's the best one. That's the best one.
It's the simplest mechanism. It's the simplest. There's degrees of best, and we can get into that. But then the other model, and this actually kind of stems from a bit of a historical thing. So late 1800s, you really had this kind of public versus private school issue that was really a religious issue. So the public schools were mostly Protestant. The private schools were Catholic. There was a lot of Catholic animus in the late 1800s. This guy, James G. Blaine, tries to insert a constitutional amendment saying no public dollars can go to a private school, which at that time sort of just meant no public dollars from the feds or the states can go to a Catholic school. He fails by I think 1 or 2 votes in the U.S. Senate, but basically 30 other states went along and did their own version of this within state constitutions. Fast forward 100 years or so when, basically the various court cases and whatnot have stripped out kind of all religious identity from public schools, and private schools themselves have become, Catholic schools used to be about 15% of all schools, all kids going to a type of school in the 1960s to where now it's much less than that. It's a single digit percentage. So all in all, some of these states have what are called those Blaine amendments that have a version, and the Supreme Court has struck down a lot of them, but some of them are still worded as, no public dollar can go to a private school. And so therefore the Supreme Court, and the way around this, the Supreme Court has ruled that if you issue a tax credit, so a donor donates to a scholarship group like your local charity and says, "Hey, I want to, have a scholarship go to a poor kid at St. Michael's or whatever," you can get a tax credit for that donation. That is not state money, right? It's a credit. You're just kind of changing the ledger. It's no public money being appropriated like a voucher or a scholarship program. So therefore, that's the way around those state constitutional dynamics.
So let me understand this. Okay, voucher, cool. That is an easy concept.
Easy to get, yep.
Okay, so the tax credit, you get a tax credit, so that gets written, you can write it off against your income at the end of the year.
Correct. So let's say
is that how I read it?
Correct. Let's say you had, just for some round numbers, you had a $30,000 tax bill. You donated $10,000 throughout the year to a scholarship kid. With a tax deduction system, you're only writing off 30 cents for that $10,000. So it's $3,000 of a deduction. Whereas in a tax credit system, you actually can write the whole 10,000 off. So your tax bill. So that's where it's a tax credit for the donation. There are some people that do, and there are some states that have a form of a refundable tax credit. So meaning for a parent that sends their kids to a private school, they can get some money back from the state just for paying that tuition. So again, there's variances of the mechanism.
So that's where I can only imagine when you're in battles out there trying to communicate that to people can be a little challenging.
Yeah, but for the end user, the parent, it's, hey, you control either funding or private money becomes available for you to go to a type of school. The third mechanism that got created about 14 years ago, first in Arizona, is what's called, again, probably not the best framing of it, but an education savings account, where you get a state account that the state deposits money into that account, and you can actually spend it beyond tuition. You can spend it on textbooks, tutoring, special needs therapies, right? And that's actually the most popular form of education kind of choice policies now, is because it's more flexible, right? And goes to this notion of, hey, everybody needs an individual education. Sure, maybe 70 to 80% of kids or families are using the ESA accounts for private school tuition, but many of them are kind of doing a la carte education or are using it for homeschool expenses. So that's this newer method that is really popular, and it kind of gets away from this old school public versus private battle and says, no, this is about customized education, right? So that's those are the three main types of policy mechanisms: kind of the straight up scholarship, the tax credit funded scholarships, then the education savings, education spendings account, however you want to call it.
Kind of like a 529 in some way, or a 401k. You can tuck it away, and then it's dedicated to education.
Yeah, so it's a 529, but imagine the state is putting money in that account. So you're not taking your own after-tax dollars to put in there. It's the state is depositing your money. That's right. So again, that's where parents in Arizona, or in Florida, parents are getting $8,000 per kid per year deposited into these accounts. They're not getting taxed on these accounts. It's their own funding that they paid taxes into. They're just sort of getting it back. So it's wildly popular. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I want to move on to another subject here about you personally. But
sure.
I want to touch on this COVID thing, because my understanding is public schools have just lost, the enrollment is dropping. And these smaller, focused, in home. I know that the Catholic and other private institutions, their enrollment they're popping at the seams.
Yeah.
So I guess my question would be, relative to the curriculum, we have two things. We have COVID, which is this thump on us, and then we have a curriculum that is, like you said, that seems to be more focused on social issues rather than basic education. So kind of maybe you can touch on both COVID and that curriculum.
Sure.
If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, briefly on COVID, here's what's really interesting, and a lot of people don't know this. Public schools in some states were closed essentially for 2 school years. And people go, why is that? And why is it that 90% of private schools were open by the fall of 2020, right? When only 40% of public schools were open for in-person learning in any form. It's like, what's going on there, right? It's like, well, again, Catholic schools, private schools, they understood, like, look, we have to serve our families. Families and these kids need to go to school. We already have figured out the kind of the elements of COVID, and do we understand how to battle it within a classroom setting? kids aren't being affected in the way that adults were. There's ways to manage and mitigate the risks there. The public schools and the unions, this is why they're so sinister. They realize, no, this is the point of leverage. We need to use this, keep the schools closed as long as possible so that we can get the biggest infusion of cash from the federal government we can. And they won, right? The unions got, the final tally was $192 billion with a B for COVID, reopening and, learning loss and everything like that, which for some context, if you just said we're going to take all that $192 billion and give it as a bonus, a portion of bonus to every public school teacher in America, that'd be $60,000 per public school teacher as a bonus.
Wow.
So that's the type of money we're talking about. So if you're a teacher listening, you should be wondering, yeah, wait, where did that money go? Because my paycheck didn't necessarily jump off the charts. But
Yeah.
So they were using the COVID and the reaction to COVID, essentially. They use it as a point of political leverage to really game the system. But who did that hurt the most when you're closing schools that long? It's the poor kids, right? It's those lower middle income families that were, how do you rearrange childcare if you're working two jobs and you're a single mom? Like, what are you going to do, right? It's a nightmare, and it was horrible. And shame on the unions, and they should, suffer a lot of consequences for what they did. The test results show that these kids are on average 2 and 3 years behind, even the kids that got somewhat caught up in the last couple of years. And then Catholic schools are 2.5 years ahead of that kind of average, when you're looking at the peer-to-peer studies. So then when you're talking about the curriculum, the kind of the methodologies, how we do all of this, again, the reason why you're seeing both a huge boom in homeschooling is that, again, when parents got the kind of veil lifted back and some of the schooling went online, they started to see, wait a minute, when I'm keeping my kid in there for, I forget this kind of the total amount of hours over a K through 12 lifespan, it's like 18,000 hours your kid's spending there, and they're not learning much. We need to figure something out. Home education, some people love it. I think about 3 million families are homeschooling now, and that's up from, I think, about, less than 1 million before the pandemic broke out. Private schools, yes, they've seen a jump. Many schools have wait lists, but there's still a lot of empty seats. And in places that don't have like a big school choice program where we passed that law, they still have a lot of opportunity to fill up those seats and give families kind of more options. But then when you're talking a broad range of curriculum and all sorts of things, there's a lot of ways you can do it. And you're going to see, you and I were talking about marketing and segmentation. You're going to see, I think, over the next 10, 20 years, this sort of golden age of education entrepreneurship where people are going to develop an education method for 15% of the market that's going to work great for that 15%. Another segment is going to have this other type of instructional method or way of doing schooling. You're just going to see all, I think, versus this whole thing where we said district public schooling for 90% of America, all one size fits all.
That's just not working.
It's not going to work. And
Yeah.
now that parents will be controlling funding state by state by state, you're going to see a ton of differentiation that's going to be really exciting. I meet these entrepreneurs every day they're building micro schools, they're building kind of variations within a Catholic school model, they're building classical education type of places again. So I think you're going to see a lot of really interesting differentiation that's going to really make parents happy at the end of the day.
There's some legislation in there that you're working hard on. Your passion is fantastic, and you've been at it a long time. So let's talk legislation and then a little bit about your length of time that you've thrown into this.
Sure. So the federal piece of legislation we're working on that we have a lot of support in Congress already for. The president said he would sign it. It's a piece of tax credit scholarship legislation, like we were talking about earlier, tax credits versus just scholarships. So this would essentially let donors in every single state donate to a scholarship group, and they would get a 100% tax credit off of their federal kind of income tax bill that they're facing. Why is this a really popular mechanism, and why is it ready to go now? Look, you've got thousands of scholarship groups across the country helping millions of kids already. And let's say for round numbers, $100 billion is being charitably given to these groups to help kids, and mostly kind of needy kids, go to a great school. Suddenly, this sort of federal incentive could triple the amount of fundraising they do, right? Because again, the tax math. It's like if you're just getting a deduction for a donation, well, if you're actually getting 100% credit, that's 3 times more valuable. So you're going to see a wave of private philanthropy going into these scholarship groups. And these scholarship groups can help kids in private schools. They can help them in charter schools, home schools, even public schools can benefit. So really, it's a tweak to the tax code that says, we believe that K through 12 education is such a vital national interest. We want to incentivize contributions there. So we're excited to potentially get that done this year. We're working hard at it. That'll benefit every state. You could probably almost immediately at the current budget that that the lawmakers have put in there could probably help 2 million kids instantly. I'd love to get the budget target higher so we can help even more kids.
How many, like in the House Representatives or the Senate, this has to pass?
Correct.
Like how many, just as a rough number, how many are you trying to bump over to the other side?
So because this is a tax bill, this isn't some Department of Education legislation for, a whole new appropriation. This is simply a tweak to the tax code. It can go through what is called budget reconciliation, meaning it can resist a filibuster in the Senate. So you only need 51 votes. Same thing in the House of Representatives, 50% plus one. So given that we have more than 30 Senate co-sponsors, 150 House co-sponsors, it's already in the kind of the goal line of the legislative process in Congress. And then again, no one can filibuster this to try and block it. So as they're currently debating the big tax cuts kind of rewrite, we want to get this stuck in there. And the president campaigned on school choice as his top education issue. For the president and his supporters, this is a promise kept kind of thing. So we feel like all of the boats are aligning in the right direction to get this done.
So you're on the edge.
We're on the edge.
You're on the edge. There we go. Let me use our Eagles reference, okay? We're inside the red zone.
That's right. It's in the red zone, on the goal line.
Yeah. So we'll conclude with this. What's the action steps? Somebody's listening to this, and they're hanging out, and they're like, "Wow, this guy's really cool. He's all pumped up." So, what does the American Federation for Children say? Okay, when we get done this thing, go do this.
Yeah. Well, I would say go to our website, schoolchoicenow.org. Find out if you have school choice in your state and if you're eligible for this kind of school choice funding. I'm shocked at how many parents that I talk to and friends of mine who they're like, they weren't even aware these things existed in their state, or that, my gosh, I got 4 kids. I want to send them to private school. It's too expensive. And it's like, well, if you lived in Arizona, you'd be getting $8,000 per kid per year deposited into your account. So want to get the word out that there are a lot of these programs across 31 different states that you could be accessing public funding to send your kid to the school of your choice. 44 states have charter schools, so get aware of your options. Secondly, get involved. Again, you can go to our website to find out more about how you can get involved in this federal fight or in your state, how to get involved there. Really, lawmakers need to hear from their constituents. It's sort of basic politics 101. The unions have their, methods of, they can just flood the zone and flood the phone lines of a U.S. senator about any sort of piece of legislation. Those lawmakers need to hear from parents on the other side saying, no, I want to put my kid in a better option, or I don't like the way that my school is operating in X, Y, or Z way. So get involved that way. I don't think you really understand, especially if you're already involved in your public or private school, you're sitting on a school board, or you are actually, maybe you run a school or you run a scholarship group. You have a really important voice in this fight. And I don't think some people just don't understand that. Even if you have a church, you actually are a really important node here too, because a lot of churches are sitting empty and they have empty space 5 days a week if they don't already have a school. And it's like, that could be turned into a school pretty quickly. There's a lot of ways that you can see a lot of innovation happening. Business owners too, right? If you're in a major city, right, you probably have a lot of underutilized kind of office space, commercial, real estate that you could turn a school into one of those things. It's already zoned. It's got the fire codes. That's is what I'm talking about. Right?
I didn't think about that. That is a good idea.
Oh, you'll love this, Mark. Mark Cuban and I got into a bit of a Twitter tussle this last year where I was saying, look, Mark, we are about to pass this in Texas, $10,500 per kid per year for Texas families, especially lower income families. They're getting preferenced here. I said, you're a big business owner, Dallas Mavericks. Why won't you open up a campus on one part of your Dallas Mavericks, big space for some of your employees that maybe they'd want to send their kid to a private school that's on campus, it's night. And he's like, no, I support public schools. I'm like, well, wait a minute. You send both your daughters to private schools. So I don't know what you're doing there. So I don't think he's responding to me anymore. But this is what we're talking about.
Let's talk about you personally.
Sure.
One of the things we like to hit on is, why'd you do this? I mean, you've been at it for a long time. Some 20 or more years, I think.
Well,
and so I think, I don't know if I'm wrong there, but so you wake up one morning or maybe thought about it and you go, I'm going to do this. This is the thing I'm going to do. So what sparked that and what keeps you going at it?
Sure. I mean, I'll start from the beginning. My parents made big sacrifices. I grew up on a farm and they wanted me to get a great education. They sacrificed to put me in private school and they drove me a long way to get into great private schools where we grew up in sort of Northern California. So education really in a lot of ways was the silver bullet for me. I wasn't thinking at that time about systemic reform and what does that mean for our entire society until, I was for my 25 years that I've been working in politics. And, about 10 years ago was when I heard about this group, American Federation for Children. They were hiring for somebody. I had the right skill set. In college, at least I got a little more aware of the kind of public policy issue around education, school choice. I read Milton Friedman's original essay from
Yeah, okay.
1950s, right? So you kind of had a notion of like, yeah, I support this. When I started working for AFC, and why I liked AFC is that we actually put our money where our mouth is. We got involved in political fights to win elections. We get involved in primary elections, which is really tough. And then when I started touring these schools, Mark, especially at that time, there was these great schools in Memphis that wonderful Catholic schools in these deep pocketed of poverty areas. And you're seeing all these kids who, when you're talking to the administrators, they're saying 15% of the kids are homeless. One little girl just asked the teacher to pray for her dad because he was shot this weekend. All these things were like, my God, like if we don't pass a school choice program now, the two anonymous benefactors of the school had passed away. They were going to run out of funding. This school might close and these kids are going to be going to some of the worst schools in America just down the road. And to me, that's when it really kind of emotionally hit me, like, my God, we have designed this system in America. Like, we find this tolerable that kids are just destined for poverty or prison or worse. If we just by the nature of this kind of zip code assigned system, whereas, it just became a real moral issue for me. And then the last 10 years took over as CEO a few years ago. This is the civil rights issue of our time. Condi Rice has said that. And when you really think about the civil rights movement in and of itself, it was actually precipitated by the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, desegregation, and then the Civil Rights, Act, everything came about 10 or so years later. There's a similar type of movement going on now in our states that if we pass this big bill in Texas, Mark, fully 50% of kids in America will be eligible for a school choice program. If we get this federal thing done, every state is eligible. The beginning of the golden age of education is about to be upon us. But yeah, it kind of came from this, for me, this moral stomach sickness that when you really digest, that stat we talked about in Baltimore, where essentially 0% of kids are proficient in math. When you start to just go state by state, community by community, how we've essentially enshrined generational poverty due to our education system's design. It's like, we have to fix this. We have to take action. We have to move. And so the revolution is here.
Well, we'll touch on this. One other action thing I really call cool is you had one called Black Minds Matter.
Yeah.
I think, and I thought that was great. First off, play on initials, but briefly, I'm presuming that's going into the Black community, and I guess what are you doing? You're just going in there and doing the same thing, letting it out, and say, hey, man, on the other side, you move this way rather than getting pulled that way. Is that you know what I mean? Like a push versus a pull.
Yeah, in the summer of 2020, after George Floyd and the kind of the uprising that was happening in this country, there was this kind of lurch on the Black Lives Matter movement. And what was fascinating was when they were talking about all these structural racist kind of institutions, right? And there's this big debate. Education was sort of overlooked. And when you look at that time, if you had looked at like the Black Lives Matter website, like their education priorities were basically copy and pasted from the teachers unions. It's just like, hey, more funding, hire more people. And again, it's like, well, okay, some of these school districts that have high poverty, high Black populations, 13% of Black boys can read at grade level. That's devastating, right? When 87% of kids aren't able to like get access to even a basically good quality of education. And so Denisha Merriweather on our team, she herself got one of the scholarships in Florida, changed her life. She had failed the third grade twice. She was destined for a really bad life, but she got into this private school thanks to the Florida School Choice Program, changed her life forever. She's a mom of two. She's a college grad and had her master's degree. She started kind of articulating this notion that, look, and especially on the political front, Mark, there's plenty who are trying to shut down school choice programs in this country, zero out the funding. Well, Denisha organized something like 400 Black-owned and operated private or charter schools in this country, saying, really, you want to shut down essentially what is a thriving school, an academy, or basically a small business owner in your community just because you're beholden to the political pockets of the teachers unions, essentially. So this is kind of the jujitsu we're doing with that project, along with just making sure that every kind of one of these Black school founders, they're able to kind of operate really well within the choice space, understand how to work within it, because they're obviously getting a lot of political pressure from the unions and others who are just tied in with that whole system to not be able to grow and thrive and be successful. So it's a really great project, and go find out more about it on our website.
I will. Well, listen, Tommy. I love Tommy because my brother Tom is Tom. I think he said Tommy.
Tommy,
he'd
that's
be
right.
like, "What? I'm not Tommy." But anyway, all kidding aside, I just want to thank you, Tommy, for coming on. I believe it's the American Federation for Children.org.
Schoolchoicenow.org or federationforchildren.org. Both get you there, but schoolchoicenow.org is a little easier to remember.
Okay. And again, you're Tommy Shultz.
That's right.
Thank you so much. Greatly appreciate the chance to get to talk to you.
Mark, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me. Have me back anytime. We can give you more updates on the victories we're getting.
I'd love to. Thank you for listening to The Mark Halley Show. If you found this story as intriguing as we did, give us a like, share the episode, and subscribe at The Mark Halley Show. New episodes every other Friday. Adios.